I heard them decide my fate through a door that was not fully closed. The sound was a low murmur, the conspiratorial hum of people who believed themselves to be alone, dissecting a life as if it were a ledger of failing accounts. My father's voice, thinned by worry and wine, was a fretful current beneath the sharp, decisive clicks of my stepmother's pronouncements. They spoke of the Duke of Alastair as one might speak of a storm on the horizon, a fearsome, inevitable force that could either destroy them or, if navigated with sufficient cunning, wash away their debts. The currency they intended to use was my sister, Rosamund. The collateral, should she fail, was me. I was the spare part in the family machinery, the dusty volume on a high shelf, noted only when the more gilded and beautiful books were already promised elsewhere. My marginalization was a condition of my existence, as natural to our household as the damp that stained the ancestral tapestries. It was not born of cruelty, not in the overt theatrical sense. It was a quieter, more insidious thing, the simple, crushing fact of comparison. Rosamund was the sun. She possessed a beauty so radiant it seemed to generate its own light, warming all who fell under its spell. Her laughter was a melody that could coax a smile from the dourest creditor, and her charm was a weapon she wielded with an innocent, devastating precision. Ilara was the shadow that proved the sun was shining. I was quiet where she was effervescent, still where she was animated, plain where she was exquisite. My worth was measured in negatives. I was not troublesome, not demanding, not Rosamund. And so, I had learned to live in the spaces she did not occupy, the library, the neglected gardens, the quiet corners of my own mind. It was in these spaces I had cultivated a life for myself, a world built from the printed words of others, rich with thoughts and feelings that required no beautiful face to be considered valid. The catalyst for the Duke's visit was a truth as ugly and pervasive as the rot in the floorboards of our crumbling manor. We were ruined. My father, a man whose kindness was exceeded only by his fiscal ineptitude, had gambled and lost and borrowed against a future that had never arrived. The Duke of Alastair was his last, most desperate hope. He was a man of immense wealth and influence, a figure spoken of in hushed, intimidated tones. He was also, it was said, a man encased in grief, sealed away from the world since the death of his young wife years ago. He was a winter king, and my family intended to offer him a springtime bride in the form of my sister. My role in this grand production was to be invisible. I was tasked with ensuring the household ran with a semblance of its former glory, a feat of domestic alchemy that involved stretching 3 servants to do the work of 30. I was to manage the illusion, to polish the tarnished silver of our reputation, and then to melt back into the shadows from whence I came. The Duke arrived on a Tuesday, the sky a bruised purple that threatened rain. His carriage was a slash of black lacquer and polished brass against the faded green of our overgrown drive, and he emerged from it not like a man, but like a judgment. He was taller than I had imagined, with a severe, unyielding posture that seemed to hold the very air at a distance. His features were stark and angular, as if carved from granite, and his eyes, when they swept over the peeling paint of our portico, were the color of a winter sea. My father bowed too low. My stepmother's smile was a brittle, painted thing. Rosamund, breathtaking in a gown of pale blue, was the perfect picture of innocent beauty, a porcelain doll presented on a velvet tray. I watched from an upstairs window, a ghost in my own home, as the pieces of their desperate game were set upon the board. I felt a strange, cold pity, not for myself, but for the Duke. He was being sold a pretty lie, and I wondered if a man like that, a man who looked as though he had seen the very bones of the world, could ever be fooled. My first encounter with him was an accident, a collision of 2 worlds that were never meant to touch. The library was my sanctuary, a room that smelled of aging paper and leather and beeswax. It was the only place in the house where I did not feel like an apology. I was perched precariously on a rolling ladder, reaching for a volume of botanical illustrations on the highest shelf, a fine layer of dust powdering my dark dress and my hair. I believed myself to be entirely alone, lost in the quiet communion with my books. The click of the latch was so soft I might have imagined it, but the change in the room's atmosphere was undeniable. A new weight, a new silence, settled in the air. I looked down. The Duke of Alastair stood just inside the doorway, his presence sucking the very warmth from the room. He was supposed to be in the gardens with Rosamund, listening to her charming chatter, falling under her spell as all men did. Instead, he was here in my world and he was looking up at me. I froze, my fingers still outstretched. A dusty, disheveled creature caught in the high branches of my own refuge. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. I expected him to turn away, to dismiss me with the same polite disinterest the rest of the world employed. I expected a glance, a curt nod, perhaps a flicker of annoyance at finding the room occupied by a servant, for that is surely what I looked like. He did none of those things. He simply watched me. It was not a glance, not the polite sweep of a gentleman's gaze, but a direct, unervingly focused look. His eyes, which I had thought merely cold, were sharp with an intelligence that seemed to strip away all pretense. It felt as though he were not seeing a plain, forgotten daughter on a ladder, but something else entirely. He was seeing me. He saw my surprise, my mortification, the smudge of dust on my cheek. He saw the book I was reaching for. There was a long, suspended moment where the entire world seemed to shrink to the space between us. A space filled with the scent of old books and the silent, shocking weight of his attention. I saw a flicker of something in his expression, something I could not name. It was not pity, nor was it admiration. It was recognition, as if he had found something unexpected, something that did not fit the neat narrative he had been sold. That single, disruptive gaze was the striking of a match in the dark, and in its brief, startling flare, everything changed. I did not know it then, but my life, the quiet, predictable, invisible life I had so carefully constructed, was over. In the days that followed, a strange and unsettling pattern began to emerge. The Duke, Lord Alastair Thorne, did not behave as my family had anticipated. He was impeccably polite to Rosamund, of course. He walked with her in the garden. He listened to her play the pianoforte. He endured the stilted, formal dinners. But his attention, the true, focused core of it, kept drifting. He would ask a question about the estate's crop rotations, and his eyes would find me where I sat silently mending linens by the fire. He would be shown a painting by my stepmother, and he would inquire as to the author of the book I held in my hands. It was subtle, so subtle that at first only I seemed to notice. It was a compass needle, quivering, then slowly, surely, pointing in my direction. My family, blinded by their own ambitions, saw nothing. To them, I was part of the furniture, a fixture of the room. But I felt his gaze like a physical touch, a constant, low hum of awareness that set my nerves on edge. Then he began to seek me out. He claimed an interest in the household ledgers, which he knew I managed. A well-run estate, however modest, speaks volumes of its keepers, he had said to my father, his expression unreadable. And so, I found myself summoned to the library, the very room of our first encounter, to sit across a great mahogany desk from the most intimidating man I had ever met. My father left us, pleased at the Duke's interest in his holdings, never once suspecting the true subject of his scrutiny was not the columns of figures, but the woman who wrote them. Those sessions were a strange form of torture and a stranger form of bliss. The air between us was thick with unspoken things. We spoke of numbers, of dwindling supplies and necessary repairs, of the hard, practical realities our family worked so hard to ignore. His questions were sharp, insightful, and utterly devoid of condescension. He listened to my answers, truly listened, his gaze fixed on my face as I explained my systems of economy, my small, desperate measures to keep the estate solvent. And then, inevitably, the conversation would stray. From the price of seed grain, we would wander to new agricultural philosophies. From there to the books that espoused them. Soon, we were no longer talking about the estate, but about Seneca and Locke, about the romantic poets and the stark prose of the Stoics. It was a meeting of minds so profound, so unexpected, that it left me breathless. I had never spoken to anyone like this. My opinions, which I had kept locked away like forbidden treasures, were drawn from me, examined, and treated with a solemn respect that felt more intoxicating than any flirtatious compliment. He did not praise my thoughts. He challenged them, built upon them, offered his own in return. I discovered a mind as sharp and ordered as my own, but vast where mine was contained. Beneath the cold, severe exterior was a depth of thought and a quiet, dry wit that appeared in brief, surprising flashes. For the first time in my life, I felt as if someone were reading the text of my soul, not just glancing at its plain cover. One afternoon, a cold autumn wind rattled the window panes of the library, and I shivered, pulling my thin shawl more tightly around my shoulders. I saw him notice the gesture, a flicker in his otherwise impassive gaze. He said nothing. 2 days later, a package arrived from the village. It was a large, heavy woolen shawl, the color of moss, impossibly soft and warm. The card attached bore only the housekeeper's name, but I knew as surely as I knew my own name. The sheer, breathtaking thoughtfulness of it, the quiet, anonymous care, was a secret that warmed me more than the wool itself. He had seen I was cold, and he had provided warmth. It was an act of such simple, profound kindness that it lodged itself deep in my chest, a small, glowing ember. He later left a rare edition of a book we had discussed on the table, its pages filled with exquisite hand-colored plates of ferns and wildflowers. There was no note. None was needed. These were his words, his true conversation, spoken in a language of quiet deeds. The tension between us grew with each passing day, a fine, high wire stretched between two poles. It culminated in a moment of startling, accidental intimacy. We were both reaching for the same estate ledger on a low shelf, a heavy, calfskin-bound volume. His hand, large and warm, covered mine. It was not a lingering touch, not a deliberate caress, but a simple, shocking point of contact. A jolt, sharp and electric, shot up my arm. I snatched my hand back as if burned, my face flushing with heat. He straightened slowly, the book in his hand, his eyes dark and intense. The air crackled. The silence in the room was no longer peaceful. It was a living thing, filled with the frantic beating of my own heart and the deep, steady rhythm of his breathing. He held my gaze for a long, unbearable moment, and I saw a storm of emotion in his eyes, a conflict so fierce it momentarily broke through his formidable control. That evening, as we sat in the library, the fire casting long, dancing shadows on the walls, he broke a rule. We were speaking of his estate in the north, of the solitude he found there. I had, without thinking, used his formal title. "Your Grace is fortunate to have such a retreat." He turned his head and looked at me, the firelight carving his face into planes of light and shadow. His voice, when he spoke, was low and quiet, yet it commanded the entire room. "You must call me Alistair." It was not a request. It was a gentle edict, a dismantling of the final barrier between us. The use of his Christian name was a shocking intimacy, a step across a social chasm. My breath caught. The name felt heavy and unfamiliar on my tongue, a word of immense power. I looked at him, at the earnest, vulnerable plea in his eyes, a plea that contradicted the commanding tone of his voice. After a beat of silence that stretched for an eternity, I nodded, my throat tight. "Alistair," I whispered. The name was a key turning in a lock I had not known was there, opening a door into a new and terrifyingly hopeful world. The world, so newly filled with a fragile, burgeoning hope, shattered a week later. I was searching for a misplaced shipping receipt in my father's study, a room he kept in a state of chaotic despair. Tucked beneath a stack of unpaid bills, I found it. A sheaf of legal papers, bound in ribbon, bearing the Duke of Alistair's formidable seal. My father was not a man for organization. His carelessness was legendary. My hand trembled as I lifted the document. I told myself it was not my concern, that I should put it back. But a cold, creeping dread had already taken root in my heart. I untied the ribbon. The legal language was dense and convoluted, but the meaning was brutally clear. It was a contract, A loan agreement between my father and the Duke. For a sum so astronomical it made me physically dizzy to read it. Our entire estate, every last acre and crumbling stone, was signed over as collateral. But that was not the worst of it. The worst was the final clause, written in a precise, merciless script. In the event of default on the loan, the debt would be forgiven upon the successful marital union of the Duke and my father's eldest unmarried daughter, Miss Rosamund Merriwood. And then the final, devastating sentence. Should Miss Merriwood refuse or be deemed unsuitable, a suitable replacement from the immediate family was to be offered. If no union could be achieved, the estate and all its holdings would be forfeited immediately. A suitable replacement. The words echoed in the silent room, mocking me. There was only one other daughter. Me. The blood drained from my face, and a roaring began in my ears. Every moment of the past weeks replayed in my mind, twisted and corrupted by this new, horrifying knowledge. His gaze in the library, was it not recognition but assessment? His questions about the ledgers, a test of my competence, my suitability as a ducal asset. The shawl, the book, the shattering intimacy of his name, were they all part of a calculated seduction, a careful weighing of the spare part to see if it would suffice? The kindness I had treasured felt like the most profound cruelty, a gilded cage being constructed around me while I admired the workmanship. He was not seeing me, he was appraising me. I was not a woman to him, I was a contingency plan. The fragile ember of hope in my chest was extinguished, leaving behind nothing but cold, bitter ash. I did not know how long I stood there, clutching the papers that proved my own foolishness, my own insignificance. Eventually, my legs began to shake, and I sank into my father's chair, the document a venomous thing in my lap. The sense of betrayal was a physical pain, a sharp, cold blade twisting in my gut. I had allowed myself, for the first time in my life, to feel seen. And it had all been an illusion, a masterfully executed part of a business transaction. I felt a surge of white-hot anger, an emotion so foreign to my quiet nature that it terrified me. It was an anger directed not just at Alistair, but at my father for his weakness, my stepmother for her ambition, and most of all at myself, for daring to believe I could be worthy of something more than being a solution to a problem. That evening, I requested a private audience with the Duke. I would not allow him the satisfaction of a hysterical, weeping confrontation. I would be as cold and controlled as he was. I would meet him on his own terms. I found him in the library, of course our sanctuary, now tainted, a stage for my humiliation. He stood by the fire, one hand resting on the mantelpiece, the very picture of aristocratic ease. He turned when I entered, a faint, almost smile touching his lips, a smile that now looked like the smug satisfaction of a predator. "Ilara," he said, his voice holding the familiar low warmth that had once thrilled me. I did not return the greeting. I walked to the desk and placed the contract between us. I did not speak. I simply looked at him, my expression, I hoped, as hard and unyielding as his own. He looked down at the papers and his face changed. The warmth vanished, replaced by a stark, guarded stillness. He did not look surprised to see the document, only, perhaps, surprised that I was the one to present it. He raised his eyes to mine, and for the first time, I saw not control, but a deep, resonant regret. It was not enough. So, I began, my voice steady, betraying none of the violent trembling in my soul. Am I to be the suitable replacement, Your Grace? Was your feigned interest in my mind simply a more thorough method of assessing your potential property? You must tell me, does my knowledge of crop rotation add significantly to my value? The words were acid on my tongue. I saw him flinch as if I had struck him. He took a step toward the desk, his hands open in a gesture that might have been placating. "Ilara, you must allow me to explain." "Explain." I gave a short, harsh laugh. "I believe the terms are quite clear. My family is ruined, and you hold the deed. My sister is the preferred payment, and I am the alternative. It seems a very straightforward piece of commerce. I only regret that I was foolish enough to mistake your due diligence for genuine human feeling." He closed the distance between us then, standing on the opposite side of the desk, the contract a damning testament between our two worlds. His face was pale, his expression raw. "The debt is real," he said, his voice low and urgent. "That is why I came here. I will not lie to you about that. My advisors warned me against this entire venture. They said your family was a lost cause, that none of you were worth the time." His eyes held mine, and they were filled with a desperate sincerity. Everything I had been told prepared me for a house of fools and schemers. I came for a solution to a debt, a cold and simple transaction. "I did not plan for you." The words hung in the air, a desperate plea. But I had been hurt too deeply, my trust too thoroughly annihilated. "And yet you said nothing," I countered, my voice breaking despite my resolve. "You let me believe. You let me hope." Was that part of the transaction as well? He looked down at the contract, then back at me, his gaze unflinching. "Yes," he said, the admission a quiet devastation. "I knew of this contract, and I said nothing. That was my mistake. My unforgivable, cowardly mistake." He paused, and his next words were heavy with a truth that seemed torn from the very depths of him. "Because the moment I saw you on that ladder, covered in dust and glaring at me as if I were a vandal in your temple, the contract ceased to matter. The debt ceased to matter. All that mattered was the inexplicable, terrifying need to know who you were." Before I could process the shock of his confession, he moved around the desk, not stopping until he stood before me. From an inner pocket of his coat, he produced another document, this one newer, the parchment crisp. He laid it on top of the first. "I had this drawn up by my solicitor 3 days ago," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "It is a deed of absolution. Your father's debt is forgiven. Entirely. With no conditions, no marital obligations, no suitable replacements. I was a fool to wait for the right moment to tell you. I was waiting for the courage to tell you that it had nothing to do with this." He gestured to the papers. "And everything to do with you." I stared at the new document, at the elegant script that signed away a fortune, that severed the chains I had just discovered. He had done this days ago, before I knew, before the confrontation. The proof was irrefutable, a tangible act of honor that stood in stark contrast to the betrayal I had felt. My anger, my righteous fury, began to dissolve, leaving me unsteady, adrift in a sea of confusing, overwhelming emotion. He saw the change in me, the crumbling of my defenses. "Ilara," he said, and my name was a prayer on his lips. "I have spent 5 years in a winter of my own making. I built walls of grief and duty around my heart, and I believed them to be impenetrable. I came to this house expecting to find nothing but deceit and desperation. And I did. But I also found you." He took a hesitant step closer, his eyes searching mine. "You, with your quiet strength and your brilliant mind and your fierce, protective love for a world of books and ideas. You did not try to charm me. You did not even seem to notice me at first. You simply existed in your own orbit, and you pulled me out of mine. You have unmade me Ilara Merriwood. My every thought since I arrived has been of you. Forgiving the debt was the easy part. The difficult part is admitting that I do not wish to leave here without you." His confession was a torrent, washing away the last of my anger, my doubt, my fear. The vulnerability in his voice, in the proud, severe lines of his face, was the most profound truth I had ever witnessed. This was not a duke making a transaction. This was a man, stripped bare, offering his heart. My own heart, which had been a cold, tight knot of pain, began to beat again, slow and deep and shaking. Tears I had refused to shed now welled in my eyes, blurring his earnest face. I reached out a trembling hand and laid it on the deed of absolution. "You did this before?" I whispered, the words catching in my throat. "I did it the day after you shivered in the cold," he said simply. "Because the thought of you being bound by anything, least of all to me by a piece of paper, was unbearable. In that moment I understood. I understood the depth of his character, the silent battle he must have been fighting between his duty, his intentions, and the unexpected, cataclysmic arrival of his feelings for me. I saw the honorable man trapped within the cold reputation, and I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my bones, that my own feelings were not foolish, but true. I had not been wrong to see the man beneath the title. I had simply been afraid to believe it. "I accept," I said, my voice barely audible. The words were not for the contract, not for the debt, but for him, for the vulnerable confession, for the profound, terrifying, beautiful thing he was offering me. A small, wondrous smile touched his lips, a true smile that reached his eyes and transformed his severe features into something achingly handsome. We were no longer adversaries across a desk. We were allies, two solitary souls who had found each other in the ruins of a desperate scheme. And we had work to do. The summons came the following morning. A crisp note delivered by a footman, requesting my presence in the main drawing room. My father and stepmother. The final act was about to begin. I looked at Alistair, who had been waiting with me in the library. He gave me a single, steady nod. We were ready. We entered the drawing room together, a deliberate show of unity that was not lost on my family. My stepmother, Lady Merriwood, was arrayed on the chaise lounge like a general surveying a battlefield. My father paced nervously by the window, wringing his hands. The air was thick with the cloying scent of my stepmother's perfume and her even more cloying ambition. They had expected me to arrive alone, a lamb to the slaughter. They had not expected the wolf to be at my side. "Ilara," my stepmother began, her voice sharp and brittle. "We have been discussing your future. A most unexpected opportunity has arisen." She glanced at the Duke, her smile a predatory slash of red. "His Grace has expressed an interest. As Rosamund has other prospects, it falls to you. It is your duty to this family to accept." She spoke as if Alistair were not in the room, as if I were a piece of property to be disposed of as she saw fit. My father cleared his throat. "A great honor, my dear, a great honor. To save us all." His weakness was a pathetic counterpoint to my stepmother's steel. Before I could speak, Alistair stepped forward. His presence seemed to fill the room, diminishing everything else in it. He moved with a quiet, lethal grace. From his coat, he produced the deed of absolution. He did not hand it to my father. He placed it on the small table in the center of the room with a soft, definitive thud. "There is nothing to be saved from, Lord Merriwood," Alistair said, his voice deceptively calm, yet laced with ice. "Your debt to me is cancelled. The contract you signed is void. There are no obligations. Your family's fate is, as it has always been, in your own hands." My father stared at the document, his mouth agape. My stepmother's face, however, contorted in a mask of fury and disbelief. Her plan, her magnificent scheme, was crumbling before her eyes. "What is this? What have you done?" she hissed, her venom now directed at me. "You think he wants you? A plain, bookish spinster? She is not worth your time, my lord," she cried, turning to Alistair. "She has nothing to offer. Rosamund is the beauty, the prize." It was then that I felt a profound and liberating calm settle over me. For my entire life, I had been silent. I had absorbed the slights, the dismissals, the constant, grinding erosion of my own worth. I had lived in the shadows, and I had accepted it as my lot. But I was no longer in the shadows. I was standing in the light, beside a man who saw me more clearly than anyone ever had. And I would not be silent anymore. I met my stepmother's furious gaze, not with anger, but with a quiet, unshakable dignity that felt like a revelation. "You are mistaken, Lady Merriwood," I said, my voice clear and steady, ringing with an authority I did not know I possessed. "His Grace, the Duke of Alistair, asked for my hand in marriage yesterday evening, and I have accepted." I let the words hang in the stunned silence. My father looked as if he might faint. My stepmother's face was a study in apoplectic rage. I continued, looking directly at the woman who had spent years making me feel invisible. "I am not accepting out of duty to this family. I am not a pawn to be sacrificed in your desperate games. I am marrying him because I have come to admire him deeply, and because he, in turn, values me for who I am, not for what I can provide. It seems my nothing is precisely what he was looking for. I allowed myself a small, ironic smile. As for my worth, I will no longer allow it to be determined by those who have never bothered to look for it. The defeat in my stepmother's eyes was absolute. She had been outmaneuvered, her power utterly broken. She had lost the financial leverage, she had lost the social prize, and she had lost the daughter she thought she could command without a second thought. She was left with nothing but her own ambition, now turned to ash. My father simply sank into a chair, his face in his hands, a broken man undone by his own weakness. Their downfall was not loud or dramatic. It was a quiet, internal collapse, all the more devastating for its finality. Alistair placed a hand on the small of my back, a silent, supportive pressure. Without another word, he guided me from the room, leaving my family to the wreckage of their own making. He led me out of the suffocating house and into the crisp, clean air of the gardens. The late afternoon sun cast long, slanted ribbons of light across the overgrown lawns. We walked in silence to a stone bench overlooking the rolling hills, the silence comfortable, restorative. He turned to me, his severe face softened by an emotion so tender it made my heart ache. He gently cupped my face in his hands, his thumbs stroking my cheeks. "Elara," he murmured, his voice rough with feeling. "You were magnificent." And then he leaned in and kissed me. It was not a kiss of frantic passion, but of deep, profound homecoming. It was a kiss of relief, of promise, of two solitudes ending. It was the closing of one chapter of my life and the beautiful, breathtaking beginning of another. In the quiet of that neglected garden, I was no longer the spare part, the suitable replacement. I was simply, finally, loved. We were married 2 months later, not in the grand, oppressive chapel of my family's estate, but in the small, sun-drenched parish church on Alistair's northern lands. The ceremony was intimate, attended only by a few trusted friends and his loyal staff. Rosamund was there. To my surprise, she had sent a heartfelt letter, congratulating me and apologizing for her own self-absorption. She had found a match with a young, cheerful viscount who adored her laughter, and she seemed genuinely happy for me, a lightness in her that had not been there before. It was a tentative step toward a sisterhood we had never truly had. My loyal Mrs. Gable stood beside me, her weathered face beaming with pride, having accepted my offer to become the head housekeeper of Alistair's grand ducal seat. My new life was a revelation. Alistair's home was not a cold, intimidating fortress, but a place of warmth and life and, above all, books. The library was the heart of the house, a magnificent, 2-story cathedral of knowledge, with soaring windows that looked out onto the wild, beautiful moors. It was a sanctuary that dwarfed my old one, and it was mine. Here I was not an interloper, but the mistress. Alistair would find me there, curled in a great leather armchair, and he would sit with me for hours, sometimes reading his own book in companionable silence, other times engaging in the deep, searching conversations that had first formed the foundation of our love. One evening, months into our marriage, I stood at one of the library's towering windows, watching the last vestiges of sunset paint the sky in hues of rose and gold. Alistair came to stand behind me, wrapping his arms around my waist and resting his chin on my shoulder. We stood in comfortable silence for a long moment, watching the stars begin to prick the darkening velvet of the sky. "What are you thinking about?" he asked softly, his breath warm against my ear. I leaned back against his solid strength, feeling a sense of peace so profound it was almost overwhelming. "I was thinking about shadows," I confessed. "I spent so much of my life feeling as though I lived in them, that I was one. I used to resent it. I thought it made me less." I turned in his arms to face him, tracing the strong line of his jaw with my fingertips. "But now I think perhaps living in the shadows taught me to see. It taught me to observe, to listen, to understand the world in a way that people who live in the bright sun never can." and it taught me to recognize a man who was living in a shadow of his own. Alistair's eyes, the color of a winter sea, were filled with a deep, abiding love. He brought my hand to his lips and kissed my palm. "It was your light I saw, Elara," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Even in the dust and the shadows of that library, especially there, you were the most real thing in that entire house. You were the only thing that mattered." He was right. I had not needed to become someone else to be found. I had not needed to be brighter or louder or more beautiful. I only needed to be seen, truly seen, by the one person whose gaze could chart the constellations of my soul. My quiet strength had called to his, my hidden world had welcomed his, and together, we had built a new world, a home forged not from duty or convenience, but from the simple, miraculous fact of being perfectly, completely understood. The Winter King had found his quiet queen, not on a throne, but on a dusty library ladder, and in doing so had brought the spring to both their lives.